Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Meet the Author webinar. Our curriculum today is My Financial Future, a financial literacy curriculum developed by the University of Florida. I'm Elena Massler with the National 4-H Council, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First, the webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized, which means you can open, close, resize, and move any of the windows you have open. The icons at the bottom of your screen represent these windows. I'd like to highlight just a few of them now. First, the question mark represents the help guide, which covers common technical issues. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, try clicking here first. The message icon in the middle of the list opens the group chat box. We recommend that you open this now. It's a great way to communicate with fellow attendees as well as ask questions of the presenter. And I do note that Mike has some discussion questions for all of you in there, so open that box at this time. The piece of paper represents the resource list. There, you'll be able to view and download a copy of today's presentation, as well as a list of financial resources for use. There are also links to the 4-H Mall and to upcoming webinar registration. And lastly, the person icon has presenter information. This contains the speaker's bio and contact information. A recorded version of the webcast will be available in approximately 1 day and can be accessed using the same link that you used to sign on today. So feel free to listen again and also please share it with colleagues. So without further ado, our presenter today is Dr. Michael Gutter. Dr. Gutter is the Associate Dean for Extension and the State Program Leader for 4-H Youth Development, Families, and Communities for the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences at the University of Florida. And that may be the longest job title I think I've ever read. His research and outreach focuses on improving financial knowledge and behaviors and enabling access to financial resources and services. I had the pleasure of seeing Mike present at a conference last fall, and I can say that he's a dynamic and engaging presenter. So we're all in for a treat today. And with that, thanks for joining us. And Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, and it's great to have all of you all joining me. I always say it's fun, so hopefully feel free to type in as much as you want to, because we won't see any nodding heads or any smiles of that maybe you get something we're saying or you like something that was said. So you can't chime in too much is what I would politely add to it. So I wanted to kind of set off, and the reason why they got your group chat out is I kind of jump right in and get everybody thinking a little bit about this. So I thought we might set the tone a little bit with, as we start saying, why are certain things important? So let me ask you this. So in your group chat box, if you want to go ahead and put, just your state, and I assume everybody's with 4-H in your state, but if not, it'd be great to know that too. If you're one of our partners, it's great to have you joining us. But more importantly, when you type that in, I'd like you to add what your first memory of money is. So this can be sort of the first thing you really remember that money was an issue or a factor in your life, even if it's a very innocent thing, or if what's kind of the first thing that anyone ever tried to teach you about money. So it'll take a few minutes, but I'm a patient presenter. So take a few moments and talk a little bit about that. Go ahead and take your time and type something in if you don't mind. So those are some of the nice things that I like to see. I like this, wanting to buy something at a store, allowances, getting to pick something out of a store, being given an amount. A few people here are getting allowances, savings, feeling clueless when you did do something when banking for college. So we get that a lot for those of us that have taught on university campuses. Janice talked about earning money from selling animals, and I love that. Stacy actually had a money management lesson in Sunday school with envelopes, so that's kind of nice. Nikki talks about the camp store. And so part of this is that we learn about money, and money is kind of part of our culture in some ways, certainly, and it's really tends to be a part of a lot of people's cultures, although it doesn't have to be the value. It doesn't have to be the focus. And so the reason why we kind of talk about this is that we've all learned from money in different ways. And one of the first things that we talk about, right, is, this notion of, well, why financial literacy? Well, why financial literacy? I mean, that's kind of this interesting question, isn't it? I mean, why is that the case? So what do we think about the status of people's financial behavior, right? Tara talked about not knowing what to do with certain things when she went to college. And so how many of you have ever felt this hopelessness about this or known people that really seem kind of lost when it comes to basic personal finances? This is that interactive part again where, I say, what do you think? So what do you think? Have you encountered people that don't really seem to have a good understanding of personal finances? I like that, Steve. And I definitely. Right, Anne, couldn't agree with you more. When I saw you from Pennsylvania, I figured you might say something great like that. I appreciate that comment. And so this is an issue, right? And a lot of this is, we'll talk about the behaviors. I mean, do youth need to understand personal finances? I'd like to think I'm preaching to the choir in the sense. I mean, this is a pretty big life skill that every one of us deals with. And part of this is that in many states over the course of several decades, this was phased out of education. We've seen in a lot of states that personal finance is creeping its way back in as a state standard. Florida now says it's a state standard, but not one we test for. Illinois, for example, I think even went to a point of testing it for a while as part of their state assessments. So we went from not teaching home economics, right, in schools to reintroducing personal finance some of the times in some of the states in some of the schools. And what that means is that a lot of people are going to slip through the cracks. And that's really kind of something there. And there's people that live paycheck to paycheck. And so part of this is that while there's money to be made from getting people to invest and build wealth and buy insurance products, there's only so much money to be made from teaching people the basic responsibilities of finances, understanding, cost benefit, understanding good decision making. And that's kind of where people say, why do you do this? Well, so this is what I know. I spent, prior to being an administrator, as they say, going over to the dark side, I spent about 15 years being a state specialist studying financial behavior and financial decision making. And a lot of my research focused on college students and high school students. I've looked at adults too. We're an interesting group for those of us that claim to be adults on the call. But youth were a fascinating thing because so much of what they were doing was a product of what they learned. And so I researched something called economic socialization. And it really had a lot to do with how youth learn about money. And that's because money is laden with values. Money is laden with behaviors and decisions that have to be made. Money is a scarce resource for that matter. And so when we think about all of those money-related things, we realize there's a lot we're imparting to it. So we talked about sort of what our first memories are of money, and now I'm going to ask you another question. This is one we put a lot in surveys. How many of you would say your parents were, would you say your parents were savers or spenders? So were your parents savers or spenders? And I'm not writing this down. There's no IRB. A big spender. I like that. That's right. That's great. Sorry, Tina. I'm sure it wasn't that funny, but it was funny reading it. So Tina talked about mom was a spender and dad tried to be a saver, but he just lost those battles. And Janice talks about balance. We call that balance, Janice. I like that. Paying the bills first, saving money, and then having some fun with what's left over. And so that's kind of a lot of those different things there, right? And so can we all agree that probably what we watched our parents do, whether we do the same thing or do the exact opposite, right, usually had some influence on us. And part of it is what we observed from their behaviors. Were their behaviors successful? Whether or not they were good or bad, as we might judge them, right, objectively, did they work, right, which is one of those things. So maybe your parents didn't have this big formal budget, but it didn't matter. They did just fine. And so you might not have one, and maybe it's okay for you, and maybe it isn't. And so what we know, right, is that in general, parents don't actually like to talk about money. And there's several reasons why. They come from parents who didn't like to talk about money, and money is one of those things we don't talk a lot about. Most of us will talk about a lot of things with our friends and colleagues, and money and income tends to be not one of them. Parents don't like to also do it because they don't know a lot. Many of us don't know a great deal about how credit works or whether or not this makes sense financially or that. We don't do compound interest in our head. And so parents don't always like to talk about anything that they don't understand very well, just because they feel awkward about it. So we certainly see that. And those of us in 4-H know that that's, partly why youth-adult partnerships can be so important, because every parent isn't an expert in everything. My dad wasn't very good at knowing a lot about how to raise animals, but you always make sure you know someone who is. The other side of this, too, is that when it comes to financial education and the role of extension in 4-H in particular, is there's a lot of information out there. And for any of you who have been in financial education or talked to youth who have done this, there's a lot of people selling things that are out there. And that's kind of challenging because there's potentially agendas, there's biases in the information, there's cookie cutter recommendations, everybody ought to do this. And that's not necessarily the best thing. What I try to focus on is giving youth the life skills to make good decisions at the right times. So social learning and understanding economic socialization is a big part of this. And extension, as it does in many cases, because I'd like to think that 4-H not only helps our youth understand vital life skills, but provides them with opportunities to practice and hone those, provides them with opportunities to connect that, bringing in the youth-adult partnership, thinking about how we integrate some of these pieces is a really big part of it. And so I've always felt that 4-H is a great mechanism from this socialization process in terms of how we really play a vital role in how youth grow and really kind of get on that trajectory to thrive. So what we know, right, is that youth who engaged in a greater frequency of financial social learning opportunities, and this was getting a chance to learn more about money, hear more about money, practice more with money, watch more with money, were simply put more likely to do the right things when they had a chance. And so we did this by looking retroactively at youth's experiences, but really focusing on them at that college and post-college age. Because that's really when opportunity to practice so much of these financial behaviors is important. And so one of the challenges with financial literacy is, of course, that the things we most want them to do, they won't really get a chance to do for a couple of years unless we look for those opportunities. And that's why I asked you to start with your first memories of money, because most of those were when we were kids. Most of those were when we were younger youth, as I put it. Not clover buds necessarily, but certainly 4-H age. And so that's certainly something that we kind of want to keep in mind, is that those are a lot of those years where we learn some basic values and some basic understanding of how money works. So what did we do? Well, a couple of years ago, I'd been working in this space for quite a while, and I got a great chance to work with Tara and others to really kind of talk about what was necessary. And Judy Levings, who is our state curriculum coordinator here at Florida 4-H for quite a few years, and I kind of teamed up and worked together really on a program that we thought took what we understood from the research about what some core things were that we know affect youth's financial outcomes, and really tried to make sure that we put good information together and really put it into a package that was consistent with how we thought 4-H programs might be most effective. We really wanted to make sure we were addressing essential elements and that we really were doing this the right way. And so we really saw that, the purpose was to really align this with the critical life skills, which were really focused on decision making. The information is consistent with programs that have been used, a lot of evidence behind some of the different mechanisms that were there. And the programs themselves, every activity, every piece of the curriculum has been pilot tested already. I did a lot of it personally just to kind of put it through the paces as a specialist. We did a lot of this in Alachua County schools here in Florida, as well as different summer camps. And so, keep in mind, one of the things we tried to make this something that would be flexible for county agents so that they could put it into different mechanisms that they might be using depending upon it. Some states are very school enrichment driven. Other states are might be more community club. Florida has a balance, and so we have counties using it in different ways. Some are doing it with school enrichment, and some are going to do it actually in summer camps. So with the curriculum, the idea was to also think about that when it comes to ages and stages, as Kate Fogarty, one of our state specialists, likes to help us understand, that what youth need to know about personal finances, and more importantly, what they're likely able to digest, as we know, is going to vary over time. And so under that guidance, Tara and her team really kind of authorized us to be able to do both a beginner and an advanced version. One that, is a beginner, obviously focusing on, youth, getting them to understand some core basics about it. Simple things like what is inflation, although we'll find that our favorite way to teach this is we never use the word, and by the end the youth are describing it, and some of them know what the word is by the time themselves, which is kind of fun. So there's some neat activities we'll talk about. And then we also have our advanced curriculum, which is really meant to be focusing more on that middle school, high school audience with lots of self-directed activities, as well as some of the group activities that can be quite fun to do. Here we certainly want youth to be thinking a lot about their futures and applying this to situations that are parallel to a lot of their own. So lots of cases and lots of, situations that really parallel some of the stages and aspects of their own lives. And then, of course, having had to teach an extension myself for quite a few years and being well trained by county agents, as I always say, we created a facilitator's guide because there are some suggested solutions and talking points that aren't in the youth workbooks. And so we were able to work together with National to put together a facilitator's guide that has some of the quantitative solutions, but really also has some great just elements of discussion that we think are things that are worth including, as well as some suggested background for people that this might not have been their first love or passion. So certainly we wanted you guys to get a sense of the fact that we really tried to provide a broad spectrum to make sure that we're able to address just whatever type of youth you might be working with in your counties or your agents might be working with in their counties. So beginner workbook around ages 7 through 12, really. I strongly recommend the use of volunteer facilitators for a lot of this. As is always, and I think that's the way a lot of our programs work. We'll talk a little bit later about where we found some great volunteer sources for those of you who may not have volunteers that are comfortable with this background. The lessons in the beginner workbook really are around the 30-minute range. There's a few that go longer distance that are more integrated in nature, but we do try and keep them brief so that they make sense as part of potentially a bigger effort, but certainly something that we think is, again, a good experience. The advanced book really starts thinking about that teenager years, right? So ages 12 to 19, really, if you will. I have had some FCS agents tell me that they're working with this with some post-high school audience, some that are potentially being released from juvenile detention and others. So they found this to be a good program for just really emerging adults as well. Some of the lessons are still very relevant to those individuals, although obviously it's written more with a traditional teenage audience in mind, if you will, in terms of some of the situations and aspects. In the advanced workbook, right, we really, again, as always, you'll see we keep talking about volunteer facilitators. And I also wanted to point out, too, a new version of the workbook that we'll briefly hit on that focuses on risk management assessments. And this is really because a lot of questions that start coming up that youth get interested in, we were surprised, but realized we did not put this in the original versions, focused on everything from car insurance to really understanding how that changes. And Tara's comment about what to do when people first go to college, budgeting becomes one thing, but then others all of a sudden have these burdens of expenses they aren't familiar with, like a need to obtain car insurance because all of a sudden they have a car to go get to a job or something similar to that. So that's a little bit just to kind of set the stages for what the scope is. when we think about kind of what we tried to do, and I don't know, well, actually I'm curious, how many of you have taught financial education or money management types of subjects in the past in your counties or, potentially in other circumstances? So how many of you have done some of that before? That's great, Stacy. And we'll talk about those too. So hold that thought, Stacy. With the simulations, for example, that's a big part of it. And we'll talk about how this curriculum is a great prep for some of those to have those be a capstone experience. So hold that thought. And the reason why I bring this up is some of you know, whether you've been teaching youth or adults, finances can be challenging sometimes to make interesting. We try and do a lot of things to be creative about it, to make it interactive, but sometimes there's math, we always say. And I taught it at really, the freshman level myself, at the university level, but I can tell you teaching 18-year-olds about finances wasn't a lot easier than probably teaching 16-year-olds in some ways, although at least they had to show up to class, so that was helpful. But the reason why I bring this up is we really tried to diversify the approaches we took so that we were trying to appeal to some of the different learning styles. And so we certainly have, an activity-based learning. There's certainly experiential learning elements in here, games and such that are going to be a part of this as well. There's inquiry-based learning activities. There's skills assessments that we're going to use throughout. There's personal portfolio development where youth in the end are sort of thinking about what are their own choices, what are some of the own decisions they're facing, especially around what they do after high school. That's a big thing we really are going to focus on from a workforce preparedness piece. And then some basic case studies, some hypotheticals, and really getting them to think about what would they tell a friend, what would they tell a peer. So trying to bring some hypotheticals in to get them to sort of think a little bit outside the box and maybe even come up with creative solutions. Because a lot of times personal finances and making ends meet can involve more creativity than we wish it did. So what are some of the things we try and put into it? So within every module, and so I've tried to provide some excerpts from this. I don't know if all of you had a chance to order a copy of the curriculum for review. So if you haven't, I certainly encourage you to check it out. But I wanted to put up some images from there to just kind of walk you through it graphically. It's got a very nice look to it. We're very appreciative for the design support that was provided by Tara's team. We think it turned out great. And we've tried to package it in a way that it's very friendly for all involved in terms of things like skill levels, some of the specific questions, the types of life skills that were there. We've tried to be real upfront about things like the times needed, materials needed, what the expected outcomes were, and then even some prompts for some guiding issues here. Now, this is an excerpt from the facilitator's guide, as you can see. So we even, for different elements, have some opening questions to get people to start the conversation, like we did with your first memory of money, although in other times we're going to ask different things just depending upon who's involved, as you all might have imagined. So, and in the facilitator's guide, as you'll see, we link directly back to the workbooks, so there's not too hard to figure out what things fly with what sections. Within the workbook, every module is going to have some element of activity. Some of these are very physical in nature, right? Getting up and doing some jobs, and we'll talk about my favorite one here in a little while. But others are going to be there, and so we kind of want to describe the activity. Facilitators' tips are going to be provided for those, some helpful hints that can be there, and even some providing some suggested solutions, for example, if there's math-related problems. So part of this, too, is just to help people get a visual for what some of the setups would look like. Some of them are meant to be, small, brief simulations. For those of you who have done things like reality stores or living on my own simulations, some of the chapters really involve a one-station version of those just to create a particular point. So in the beginner section, and we'll talk about some of the overview of the different lessons we're covering, and then I'd like to delve into a few of them. We start with what I think the most important thing is, and, this sounds kind of funny, but those of us who have worked with youth before and those of us who have been parents before, truthfully speaking, the first lesson and the hardest lesson for youth and adults, for that matter, to master is wants versus needs. So much of budgeting comes down to decisions and prioritization. And so getting people to actually get to places where they feel comfortable knowing it's okay to want things, but to prioritize them below, so some simple pieces like this are challenging there. We deal this a lot, and we were actually surprised by how much kids really kind of had different variations of the conversations. There were lots of kids who thought certain things weren't, that what youth, for example, felt were needs and wants weren't always consistent with what the teachers thought. And that's where it got to be really kind of fun. Things like cable television or, even clothing and different things. Youth actually sometimes were far more open to minimalist things than we thought. So we think about that. Then we get into SMART goals, really just talking about how we do and build certain things. And my favorite example of one of the things we're trying to do in this lesson, and I'll tell you this, it's a little story, but I forewarned everybody I like to tell a few stories. So my son's 12 right now. When he was about 9 years old, he came to me and wanted an iPhone. And I did not necessarily think, as a dad, I have my views on whether or not kids should have phones. But regardless, I didn't really want to pay for one. And so, I told him, I'm not a big fan of you having a phone, and I'm not willing to spend money on that. I told him, I would talk to him again in a few years that I would be willing to invest in that. And he said, well, what if I paid for it? And I said, son, if you have the money to pay cash for your phone, and you can give me the amount of money that you have that it will cost for the change in the bill, then we can do that. So he said, okay, well, how much is that? And so he kind of made a note of this, right? And I left it alone at that. But what I realized he had done was set himself a SMART goal. And about 6 months later, he walked up to me and handed me a wad of cash and said, I'm ready to go to the store to buy my phone. And so what I've realized is that, we might think kids aren't going to do these things and that these goals may not matter, but I will tell you, I tell people about that because when we think youth aren't going to motivate themselves, well, the same SMART goal technique that I would have used with a 20-year-old or 25-year-old or 30-year-old or even older worked okay with a 9-year-old in terms of getting him to do that. So it's kind of neat to think about those possibilities, and so we want kids to think about simple SMART goals. We don't necessarily want the 8, 9-year-olds necessarily to be focusing too much on what they want to do in 20 years. But even getting them to think about SMART goals in the next few months can be a nice building exercise. We talk about bringing home the bacon. And, I tell everybody that's one of my favorite phrases. And here it's just about, again, simple things like where does the money come from? Getting them to think about the sources of money and where does money come from at your ages. Is that chores? And a lot of times it gives parents an opportunity to provide some structure. When we've asked this money in the classroom, a lot of kids have said, well, I just ask my parents for money and they give it to me. Now, does that make anyone else cringe a little bit? That all the kids had to do to get money, when I said, where do you get money from? They said, I ask my parents. Well, I had to earn money. And I had some responsibilities. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily the right answer, but it does convey a certain message when all I have to do to get money for the first several instances I needed is simply ask, with no sort of burden, responsibilities, or mechanisms. And so there's a lot of debates about that, but we want youth to kind of understand that. And even if it is the bank of mom and dad, as I put it, well, I think we want to make sure that youth appreciate that then and at least respect it. So we get into things like money personality. We talk about spending, making some specific decisions, so giving kids a chance to think about how they would spend their money. And some of this borrows from early level versions of consumer choices and consumer judging that some of you might do, because I've always liked that model and worked with consumer judging for quite a few years. We talk a little bit about where money is, and again, thinking about basic things here like, understanding how a bank works and what a savings account is, and so some basic pieces like that. And a few other pieces, getting them to think a little about where money goes and where money comes from, and also a little bit about thinking about what life and careers look like. Now, in the advanced, we start getting down and dirty, is what I say. We get to things like earning income and career planning, talking about what types of jobs are out there, how do people get paid from jobs, whether it's consulting, salary, commissions, and we'll talk about an activity to explore some of those, exploring career options, factors that even affect how much money we get so that we can set budgets, organizing cash flows, everything from goal setting to how to set up a record-keeping system so that when you go to college, you know what to do with your money and how to make those bills get paid. Most of the time, once we look at youth who are emerging under their parents' minor status, if you will, so their kids are starting to age out 17 and 18 and opening their own bank accounts, and all of a sudden they're responsible. We want them to think about putting money away for the future, as well as understanding the credit records that they start building generally when they're 18 as they start engaging in various transactions. So we try to cover some of those. Now, as we look at the curriculum, and again, we'll delve a little deeper into this in a moment, but how is the curriculum being used from what we've seen? So it's being done in some club programs as just another project book, which is great, and that's certainly what we said is one of the original designs. We're certainly seeing county-wide projects and programs as well. So looking more at activities and starting to create some groups that are talking about it. We have in Florida with our State Farm grant, we're also going to have some peer education and mentoring happening where as a result, we just received a grant from State Farm. We're using this curriculum and a few other pieces that are out there. We're going to have FCS and 4-H agents and volunteers mostly working together to guide some of our high school youth through the curriculum and getting them to help teach elementary age youth about financial literacy as well. And so we've got several counties that are going to be piloting that peer education type of model. The school enrichment has been there as well, and I encourage people in states who have financial literacy standards to explore this. One of the things we did in designing this was to look at things like the Jumpstart standards for financial education, K through 12, and try to do our best to address some of those. So you'll find a lot of our curriculum does address things like Jumpstart standards and others that are serving as the basis for what many states are requiring. And of course, it can also be a great after-school program and might work well with your partners, like if you're working with Boys and Girls Clubs, United Ways, or other extended day programs for youth. So a few other pieces here too. We also, I know some of you have military camps going on and working with those individuals, so we can see it there. Someone also mentioned simulations, and in Florida, one of the things we've done is that we're using our Living on My Own simulation. It's a reality store type of approach. It's just one we did a new redesign on. And we're using this as a recommended capstone activity. So the idea is that if youth go through the entire workbook together, or if it's done as a school enrichment activity, that things like the life simulations are done as a capstone to really kind of allow you to demonstrate the decision making that we're hopefully have been helping them to learn more about. So that's something that we think is a great way to kind of do that and provides nice observation, provides some ability to observe, if you will, some of the outcomes we're hoping to see. So as I mentioned, in the beginner activities, there can be some sample things that we've done that we talk about, wants versus needs. So how many of you, if you've ever tried to have this conversation, so for the simulations, that's a great question. It does vary. So when we talked about like LOMO, for example, Stacy, the Living on My Own simulation as we have it is really a high school age audience. We have some agents who have used it with younger youth, as I like to put it, or the beginner audiences, but certain elements had to be streamlined just because it got too complicated. So we've certainly seen that. So, but definitely a middle school, high school audience, we think it works well for, Stacy, as far as that goes, and ties really nicely to the advanced module. But I think it's worth exploring for the beginner module too. So that's a really great question. When we look at things like the sample activities, when we talked about things like wants versus needs, we provide a simple kind of structure for how people might do this. One of the things that we recommend too is to use props a lot, and so we've recommended this to our agents. We've provided some mini grants for them to buy some props. So it can be helpful, to kind of have these things to hold up, get youth kind of talking about whether or not something's a want or a need, how families can do it. And so I always like to say, well, what are some possible wants or needs? So let me ask you guys to vote on one or two of these just because. How about a dog? Is a dog a want or a need? Oh, very thoughtful answer, Ann. Good. So, and that's the kind of neat conversations now. I like that, Linda, unless you already have it. Then you know you need it. Let me ask you another one. And again, I always say think about these from our perspective as an adult in our lives and then sort of thinking about it for, let's say, in this case, a 9 or 10-year-old. What about a laptop or some similar computer? Is that a want or a need? Yeah. So this is kind of interesting, right? And what's interesting is how much that changes over time. Certainly when I was in college myself, which quite a few years ago, as some of you probably are guessing, I didn't have a computer. I didn't need one. I needed to have access to one, but I didn't need one. But it becomes more really nowadays, it's really hard for students to have them. We could say, well, get a job and support yourself and do some of these other things, but then they can't necessarily be on campus to use public lab. So it's really hard. And, the amount of work that youth need to do. So part of this is not that there's right answers. Part of this is to get them thinking about these questions, just like we do. And that's kind of where we, as Barbara kind of says, if it's required for school, it becomes a need. And that's kind of how we have to start thinking about these things. And what is a want one year or a convenience can potentially evolve into a need over time. And that's what we want people to start understanding about these, that some of these answers aren't going to be fixed for life, but really that they might change over time. I want to tell you all about one of my favorite ones, too. And of course, let me first of all say, after this, then, there's going to be some things about sharing, processing, reflections, generalizing. So really getting them through the thought processes for discussions afterwards and really making sure that we all, are able to ask some good questions as follow-up about those. But as you guys can see, people will kind of have some opinions about this, but also realize that it's not so straightforward. A neat sample activity for the advanced, right, because I believe in having some fun with some of this, as I've told you, and there's some variations of this for the beginner as well, is we want people to understand two really core things sometimes. Number one, how do people get paid, which eventually focuses into how do we learn how to budget, because we have to think about, do I get paid the same amount all the time? What affects how much I get paid? How much does that money buy me? So we decided to start with an activity on this, and so we take youth and we have them they can pick a career, different ways you can do this that we cover in the Facilitator's Guide. I usually say, do you want to be an engineer? Do you want to be a writer? Or do you want to be a maintenance worker? And so people will kind of describe to these different things, and sometimes we assign people to it. And then what I do is once they're in those groups is I say, you're a 1, you're a 2, you're a 1, you're a 2. And what I'm doing as the facilitator is assigning them to something as simple as commission or wage. So will they get paid by how much of something they do in that activity, or will they get paid by just showing up? if you will. I mean, they have to do it, but, you know, they don't have to. And so the activities I use is engineers are making paper airplanes and getting them to fly a certain distance to count a successful day of work or successful activity. We've got our professional writers. They might be tweeting. They might be writing social media posts. They might be making pictures and doodles or any number of artistic things that they might enjoy. And the maintenance worker is going to be, we recommend using pre-formed balls, but some people wanted to use wadded up paper. I think that's a little wasteful, but that's your call. And have them making sure that they go into the baskets. I'm not saying this looks like a waste paper basketball, but perhaps it does. But what we can say is that we have the youth go through these. And we've done this with agents as well, and agents have a lot of fun with this, believe it or not. And we have them go through. And they don't know what the ones and twos are. And then what they learn about afterwards is we pay them. We usually use some sort of gold coins or something similar to that. Not real gold coins, in case you were curious. Our grant wasn't that generous. And after, then they can decide what to do. We've had stores there where they can, choose to spend it, buy an eraser, buy a 4-H swag, as we put it, or they can, if it's agents, I bring candy sometimes, don't tell on me. But, just, to kind of keep it fun. And then we go back and I let them pick. Do they want to be on commission or do they want to be on a wage? And you will think everyone picks one or the other, but it's not. People who are really good at something inevitably want to go to commission the second round. People who did really bad want to, if they don't change jobs, they want to switch how they get paid. And what they realize is that when you're good at something, that sometimes you're going to want those careers that allow you to get paid more the better you are at something. And it was kind of an interesting thing. The other thing I do, which we do with our advanced classes, especially when we've done this, is the prices change between rounds. And they come out and they say, wait, why did the prices increase? And I'm like, oh my gosh, are you saying that over time prices changed while you were getting paid and all of a sudden you can't afford the same things you did before? And of course, inevitably they figure out that this is a real phenomenon, not just me being disorganized. And, most of them, if it's the advanced group, they heard the term inflation and put it together very quickly. We actually did this particular activity as we do it with seniors, with fifth graders, and the fifth graders loved it. And one of them his dad was a finance guy, and so he had heard of inflation too. He said, is this inflation? So we find that these activities, some of them people we think will probably switch down as they've had to. So it could be different kinds of things there. So a lot of these things, right, as we're kind of looking at it, how does it change and what are we looking for? And activities like that can be fun and allow for great conversation, at least we hope. And then, of course, we have the talk it over follow-up after this, some guiding questions for reflection to get them to think about how some of these concepts are much bigger than just the little scenario or the game or the activity that we played for a little while. In addition, we've tried to kind of whet people's appetites, especially in the advanced. So we talk about career paths, we talk about defining some terms that may have been used or maybe concepts that were used and putting some terms with them. So things like inflation or something we would put in a glossary because we do want people to know that that's what it's called. But more importantly, we wanted them to understand how it works and how it affects them. We tried to put in some fun facts, and this is a great thing also for those that are on different news feeds or such, that they can introduce even current events, which is hard to put in a static workbook, but we would encourage you introducing current events can certainly be fun and part of it as well. So, and as of course with Always, there's going to be additional resources available online. So with these pieces, there's, for example, we've got different videos, and we're not going to show them all today, but we created a bunch of videos at UF IFAS. Unfortunately for your viewing pleasure, I'm in some of them, but we have others that feature far more interesting and entertaining people. So I encourage you to check those out, and they can be a fun way to do it. One of the ones done by our students actually was really cool. They took my video and did a dub smash type of thing to it where they redid it, and created a whole new video sampling my phrases. So I've not been quite impressed with, I said, wow, is that what you did instead of going to class? So that's, those are kind of those big pieces there that we wanted to talk about. And again, some of the specific resources, I'll just touch base on these to make sure you've seen them, but they're available. There's the Make a Budget from the FTC, Hit the Road, some different adventures. Some things from the IRS, especially if you're doing life simulations, can be helpful. Department of Labor resources as well, and of course some things from different federal agencies and some things related specifically to preparing for college. And of course, lastly, some ones from FDIC, FTC about consumer protection, especially when we talk about credit, which we didn't get to too much today, but realize that's a big part of it too. So that kind of in mind, lots of resources, other curriculum out there. And as we kind of wanted to say, there's really great ways in which this curriculum can be used. It doesn't need to necessarily be a standalone activity. I wanted to kind of tell you that, as we were mentioning in Florida, this curriculum is the core of what we're doing right now with our state farm-funded project. But we're also using consumer choices and really trying to strengthen that as well, because we believe that good consumer and financial decision-making is the heart and soul of the life skills that we're trying to get youth more interested in. And we also know that things like full-blown life simulations like LOMO are part of it. And so our approach is really to utilize all three of those as really kind of our robust approach to youth financial literacy, but realizing that in any given scenario, club activity, local event, school enrichment program, you may not be able to do all of those. And so this curriculum was really meant to be standalone, but we'd like you to know that it also works great complementary with some of the other great resources that 4-H has to offer. So if anyone has some questions or thoughts or comments or suggestions for anything, we've got about 15 minutes or so left. So certainly open this back up to all of you for any conversation you'd like to have about this.
This is Elena, and while you all are thinking of questions and comments, please do type freely in the group chat box. I would just like to mention that we hold an annual sale during the month of April, so all 4-H curriculum, including My Financial Future, is 25% off during this month. So if you're able to plan ahead for your 4-H year, it's a great month to buy. And we're also putting together a catalog of all curriculum items, which will be hitting homes in early April, so please keep an eye out for that. And there is a link in the resource list to the 4-H Mall if you're interested in seeing more. Okay.
I had a question if I could then. Thank you, Jane. Jane, that's a great question. What we've really tried to focus on, Jane, was the Jumpstart standards, and I don't know how much Ohio's lined for those as well. I know Florida's have a lot of alignment with those. Wisconsin, I know when we were working on those while I was there, had a lot of alignment. So there's a great deal of consistency with that. At some point, if you need it, Jane, shoot me an email. We did at one point actually have a matchup talking about the different standards that were out there that we address. Tara and I had actually done that early on in this process. So let me know if that can be helpful. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'll try and find that for you. But yes, ma'am, the Jumpstart standards would be the ones that we looked to most heavily. But you'll find it also lines up with NEFI's recommendations as well, which are very parallel to Jumpstart. I'm also curious, too, how some of you, whether it's this curriculum or others, but I'd like to just, for those of you that are thinking about this out there in webcom land, how are some of you planning to use financial literacy in your states or counties? What are some of the things you have in mind? Barbara, I was about to chat back to you, of course, and and I realized I could talk. That's a really exciting one, Barbara, that you mentioned was related to foster care youth. And in fact, we've had some specific efforts on that arena here in Florida, too. I'd love to compare notes sometime about that. I think you're with Cornell, if I'm not mistaken. So love to connect with you and get you talking with some of our agents who are also thinking about that. There might even be some good common outcome measures that we'd be looking to. And I think that's great if we've got club leaders that are interested, and if there's anything we can do to support them through this, we're thrilled that you're doing that. And Jane, I like this too, some traditional project books, of course, and leader-directed materials can be good. Okay, short-term enrollment projects. I think here, well, Tina, I should say, we call them spin projects here, but absolutely the 6-week model. And this definitely, I know, is something they've discussed here as well for spin clubs or step clubs, as you might call them. So that's really great. And Janice, really excited to see about school enrichment activities there. I'd love to hear how that goes. So let me know if that works well for you in terms of getting superintendents involved. That's wonderful. And Stacy, this is really good. And the package, bear in mind if we want to talk too about simulations to go with it, we can certainly talk about LOMO, and I know other states have some great ones, and you guys probably have your own already. But the package deal can be great, and I know a lot of our agents are looking at that. Cheryl, that's really great from the Teen Career Club, and hopefully we can all hear more about what you're doing with that, because that's something we're very interested in here in Florida. And Barbara, good, from the NEFI program's perspective, so that's been great there too. Well, those are some really exciting ideas, and certainly keep any questions you have coming up here, but as they told you, I'm kind of interactive, so I ask questions if you all don't. So I'll pause and let's see if any of you are reflecting on some things, other things you'd like to share. Lisa, that's a great question. And I'm glad you asked that. Thanks for bringing that up. There's some really great potential partners you can find for this. As I mentioned before, some of your financial institutions are usually going to be really interested in this. We have interest from groups as familiar to us as Farm Credit, for example. Some of you probably have relationships with Farm Credit in your states, I'd imagine. But also the financial institutions, State Farm, as you all know, is another large insurance company. We've got a lot of local banks and credit unions, too. We have a statewide partnership with Bank of America on our Florida Saves and other efforts from our FCS line. And so a lot of our banks and credit unions are certainly interested in helping to volunteer and be involved with this at different levels. A lot of them aren't necessarily able to commit to being club leaders, but they're interested in doing activities. Spin clubs, somebody mentioned. I'm sorry, I know you called them step clubs, I believe, so I apologize for that. You had a different term. But, those short-term clubs is sometimes a good fit for them as well. I'd also recommend that you reach out to 2 other groups. The Financial Planning Association has a lot of financial, CFP practitioners around your states. And most states have an FPA chapter, and so if you're not connected with them, you can talk to maybe any of your FCS agents or FCS state specialists might have some of those relationships too, and it's a great collaboration. I'd also add in Florida too, this is also a great in Florida. All agents have 5% 4-H expectations. Your states might have similar expectations, regardless of what they are and what areas they're in. And so a lot of our FCS agents are actually being involved pretty actively in this as part of their youth financial literacy efforts. So it's been a great collaboration also between FCS and 4-H. So I think there's some good choices for you there. Hopefully that's helpful, Lisa. Oh, thanks, Stacy. Forgot about the chamber group, but thank you for bringing that up. That's certainly a great group. I also should mention the Institute of CPAs, which a lot of your states may have chapters for as well. The Jumpstart Coalition for your state, if your states have those, and looking at some of your states, I know you do, that's a nonprofit coalition there too. So a lot of those are different ones that you'll find too. So there are some good fit organizations for you potentially work with. And while we work with our Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services, obviously on a lot of our everything from livestock to fairs programs, they're also Ag and Consumer Services, and also our Florida Department of Financial Services are very supportive of youth financial literacy and have been collaborating with us on several statewide competitions. So there's some local grassroots efforts as well as some good state-level partnerships you might be able to procure depending upon how much your state wants to invest in this type of effort.
Great. So at this point, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. If anyone has further questions or comments, feel free to get in touch with Mike directly. You can also reach out to us at National 4-H Council, and we'll be happy to help you or point you in the right direction. So do you have any concluding remarks to make?
Just thank you all very much for tuning in, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll be glad to help if I can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for sharing your time and expertise with us today, Michael. It's definitely an interesting topic and one that I personally am interested in very much. So I'd also like to make a quick plug for our other webinars in the Meet the Author series. So we've been hosting webinars since January, and you can access all of the recordings as well as upcoming webinars using the link on your slide, and also there's a registration link in the resource box. So I hope you're able to catch some of the recordings and also join us next week for our last week. And with that, that brings us to the end of our webcast. Thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.